Thank you. We'll go through the panel before we have any questions. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself and who you represent, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Mr. O'Donnell, staff. It's good to follow David because it's nice when landlords and tenants agree. We represent ocean carriers and terminal operators on West Coast ports. And just a quick presentation to build off of that, because both from David's presentation today and from Hassan's comments earlier, I think we're all really off the same page, looking at what needs to happen next. And really the policy challenge is, how do we shift gears and actually focus on how do we promote growth out of our investment? It isn't enough to just talk about transportation infrastructure like we used to. And this is reflected in our latest executive order from the governor. We do need to focus on greenhouse gas emissions. We do need to focus on efficiency, and we need to focus on competitiveness in order to protect our 1/3 of the state's economy and jobs and our tax revenues. There's just no question around that. Everyone's on the same page. And David mentioned some statistics about the Port of LA. And, these are real numbers. When you're looking at containers crossing a dock, you're not just looking at goods moving. You're looking at residual effects throughout an economy that create jobs, and those are jobs that need to be protected. And the risk of not focusing on these types of impacts when you're making investments and trying to decide where you want to put your next infrastructure dollar is the status quo. And our status quo right now is loss of market share and lower than projected volumes. And as you saw from those impact numbers, when you have lower volumes and you have less market share, you're not optimizing your infrastructure, you're not creating the jobs you're supposed to. And so we find ourselves in a situation a little bit different than a lot of other transportation infrastructure, because we need to talk about the business imperative if we're going to actually do our financing the way we traditionally have, which is based on the overwhelming amount of volume that you're going to be having move through that infrastructure. And so if you're relying on primary private actors to be the source of revenue for whatever it is, it's environmental infrastructure, it's a key traditional transportation infrastructure out of the gates, it's our infrastructure within the gate, you have to be mindful and sensitive to the overall financing. And right now our status quo is something we like to call bad math. We make it more expensive for you to do business, and when you do less business, it becomes even more expensive to do business, and you find yourself in a less than virtuous cycle. And cost per box then translates into loss of jobs, loss of tax revenues, which is going the wrong direction. And what we've seen is our container port market share moving up through 2006 and then dropping off. We saw our ports on the West Coast dip, while other ports around North America, including in Mexico and in British Columbia, were growing. And then just comparing the first 6 months of this year to the first 6 months of 2014, you can see we're not moving in the right direction. And some of this has to do with hangover from our labor issues at the beginning of the year. But again, when we're looking at cargo now, we're still trying to catch up from where we were in 2006, and this doesn't help. When we're looking at total container volumes, we were projecting out really robust growth. From 2006, we were looking at these numbers that we just did not come anywhere close to. We're off about 40% off of our projected volumes. And that's significant. It also means that when we're looking forward to financing this infrastructure, we need to be much more conservative about what kind of volume growth we're actually going to be doing when we're doing underwriting. So how do we focus on it successfully when we're focusing on growth? We think we need to focus on what you can actually underwrite if you're actually focusing on growth, or complement that private activity, but don't do it in a really complimentary way. Do it in a way which is spelled correctly for the compliment you want to use. But then absorb the public share of whatever externalities or public policy goals you're trying to affect over and above the actual cost of the infrastructure that's being financed. And that changes the math, right? It changes the bad math. It allows you to achieve the results you want to achieve by creating faster growth and volume, maintaining the underwriting standards that you want to maintain for your infrastructure. And as a result, you'll have more jobs, more tax revenue. It becomes a virtuous cycle. Again, one of the things that we think that needs to be taken into account when you're looking at this is just the nature of freight. There is negative externality. We all know what it is. It's either congestion on your freeway. It's pollution for neighbors. Those things need to be internalized, but our financing models don't do a good job of internalizing them. So the state, when it's looking at how do we maximize investment, how do we achieve those goals, you need to be really realistic about how to build those costs in without disturbing the underlying project finance. And then when you've done that, we think that you do get to that potential win-win that you heard about from both secretaries describing the executive order. It's not that you can't do it. You might not be able to make every single project be a win-win. But if you're making investments over the course of the long haul, you can make your system better off on both the economic and environmental front. We have a couple of things that we have working through the legislature. One of them is an IFD bill. This is SB 63 by Mr. Hall. We have another financing program that we're trying to work through is AB 678 by Mr. O'Donnell. But we also think in the special session the opportunities are there as well. When you're establishing permanent freight funding, when you're broadening authority for user fees, for true fee-for-service freight infrastructure, when you're making those investments in streamlining project permitting, and maybe doing some program-level EIRs. But also, let's not lose sight of the fact that we are competing with other states for federal funding. Hopefully that'll be forthcoming, and we can do it in a way where we're positioning ourselves best. And then lastly, I think on integrated freight planning, I include a quote from California Trade Coalition. Almost everyone on the table here is part of the coalition. We do think that you can achieve a win-win, but it has to be strategic, it has to be multimodal, and you can't assume that every single project is going to be that win-win. But if you have a long-term strategy and metrics for measuring success, we can get there, and we'll get there better. Thank you.
RJ, I'm just going to capitalize on one thing with Mike. You had mentioned that you had not been able to attain your goals, or actually reduced your goals by 40% due to the economy and whatnot. Were you able to reset any of the objectives that were put on you as far as attainment of regulatory goals in reductions?
On the environmental side?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think all in all, David mentioned it, we feel that we've exceeded our expectations on the environmental side, and we're really proud of that. So both in LA and Long Beach and in Oakland, in the container sectors, we're exceeding 80% emissions reductions in several categories. And on greenhouse gases, a lot of the programs that CAR put into place were leading edge on greenhouse gases. So we had early action items out of AB 32, included some pilot projects for cold ironing. And, you know, as an industry, we've been asked to put up about $5 billion throughout the supply chain in the ports. And that's ongoing. Those are ongoing investments. It's going to take years to work those into the system. But yeah, I mean, I think overall we feel that while there's more work to be done, it's a very successful start in a short amount of time. And we would like to see some balance in terms of how do you get back to a place where we can start growing, maintaining our market share, get back to what we feel is kind of a better chicken and egg for our financing situation, establish the baseline for your cargo to grow, and then you can finance even more environmental improvements.
And also be able to amortize your investment over a period of time. Versus,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Sodge, do you have any questions? RJ, would you please introduce yourself and who you represent, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. RJ Cervantes with the California Trucking Association. I greatly appreciate your comments, Mr. Chairman, at the beginning about including your customers, and you and your staff have been fantastic about doing that, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. And trucking currently holds the dominant mode share of goods movement activity in the state, and we expect to continue to hold that for the foreseeable future. We have a lot of challenges, but infrastructure concerns seem to be the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you're hauling logs in Siskiyou County or tomatoes in Merced or containers at the ports. Infrastructure concerns are bubbling up with our companies, and we certainly want to be a part of that solution and happy to be in this discussion. So just a little background about trucking in California in general. 33,000 individual trucking companies, and the vast majority of them with 5 vehicles or fewer in their fleets. And we're directly employing 622,000 Californians, with hundreds of thousands of more Californians employed by services and industry that back us up around the state. 90% of the total manufactured tonnage is carried by our trucking companies here, and 80% of our communities in our state are depending exclusively on us to move their goods. And the other important thing I think to mention about California's industry, trucking industry, is the diversity of it. A lot of states have just generalized van freight that's moving up and down interstates. In California, just due to the nature and diverse impact of our economy, we have agricultural haulers, dirt and aggregate haulers, intermodal folks, and all of them have diverse concerns. But as I mentioned, infrastructure is starting to bubble up for all of them. Also, just a quick note about the amount of taxes and fees that we pay into the transportation system on an annual basis. So we currently pay here in California about $2 billion of transportation taxes and fees. That's your registration fees, weight fees, vehicle license fees, and diesel taxes mainly. But we also pay an additional $2 billion on top of that to the feds for the Highway Trust Fund. And so on a per vehicle basis, here at the state, $10,000 would go to state user fees and taxes, and $9,000 in federal. I think the greatest challenge for us, and I think we probably all share this up at this table, is to provide a level of reliability and predictability for our customers. And when we can't deliver on that, our customers start to seek alternatives. And I think we saw that with some of the activity that happened at the ports this past year. But for trucks, when we look at the amount of costs that we're facing just due to congestion and infrastructure concerns, we're realizing $4.1 billion in annual costs just due to congestion around the state in our major metropolitan areas. And we're spending 54.8 million hours of just excess time. That's time above the amount of time it would usually take to move a piece of freight in free flow traffic. Just due to congestion, we're going above and beyond that. And that means lost productivity and lost jobs for Californians. These are, when we break those numbers down, hopefully this comes out clear for you up there, but obviously the LA, Long Beach, Santa Ana, Orange County area has the biggest concern here. The annual trucking delay in hours, 29.9 million hours in excess time that we're just waiting around in congestion. This is just for trucking. And $2.2 billion in congestion costs that we're facing just in that area alone. And as you can see there, it's not just a unique thing to Southern California. This pain is felt throughout the state. Your staff and others have challenged us to start thinking about, well, what are the investments that we can start to pinpoint to get at this main problem here, which is the cost and the unproductive time. And I'd like to point out 4 main categories for today, but it really starts with bottleneck relief. And on the national level, the FHWA and the American Transportation Research Institute recently completed a survey of the top freight bottlenecks in the country on freight significant locations. And it was a list of about 250 major freight bottlenecks. But of the top 55 in that list, California has 7. And these are known freight bottlenecks for interstate haulers that when you look at them on an individual basis, the amount of time and the lowered speeds at each of these locations is causing us to lose hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in unproductive time. But beyond the major interstate and interregional bottlenecks, there's also a problem with intra-regional bottlenecks. And Hassan mentioned earlier about SCAG's work with the Comprehensive Goods Movement Plan that they've recently completed. And that's really, to us, the standard for what all regions and the state should be utilizing. And they took a look at where are the top freight bottlenecks within the region and how much time and money could we save if we address them on an individual basis. So of the top 50 projects, SCAG estimated that we could save 1 million hours in time, which is just unbelievable. And so we're hoping that other regions can address this through their freight planning processes and utilize SCAG as the model moving forward. But it's clear with both of these, the interregional and interstate bottlenecks, that we need a comprehensive truck bottleneck strategy, which will then help influence our investment decisions, whether that be through the TCIF or other programs that we have. So as I mentioned, the set aside for the bottleneck release, but also for TCIF, we do think that there are critical corridors around the state that are of vital national importance, and we need to have a set aside for their long-term maintenance through our funding decisions. Another issue that pops up for us, which doesn't get a whole lot of attention, is truck parking. California currently has the worst truck parking availability in the country. Our members have to comply with federal and state rules as it relates to hours of service and meal and rest, and our trucks need a safe place to park. And increasingly, that's becoming more and more difficult in California. So on the top 34 corridors that our trucks are utilizing, 100% of our publicly owned facilities are at full capacity, and 88% of our privately owned facilities are at full capacity right now, and that's expected to grow. Recently, there was, through MAP 21, an effort to start addressing this issue, and within MAP 21, there was language that encouraged the USDOT to look at parking availability in the states. Just this last week, they released their first report of that and also announced the formation of a national truck parking coalition, which is encouraging states to be a part of that coalition to try to identify where truck parking can be expanded. And we are certainly hopeful that California will take a strong leadership role in that and serve on that coalition. And so we're look forward to working with all of you to make sure that happens. And then also agricultural corridors. It's not something we really think about from a heavy annualized truck traffic lens, but when you look at the amount of value that's utilized on our corridors that are hauling our major agricultural products, we have to ensure that those rural roads are there for the future. Because when you look at a value standpoint, $46 billion worth of commodities being hauled on our major roadways and rural roads just to move our agricultural products. And so the state needs a comprehensive plan to look at how we can protect those assets moving forward. So with that, I greatly appreciate the time, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You have a question of the individual?
RJ, your figures, the loss, I assume that's a time loss between A to Z and number of stops. I wonder if your calculation includes, when you stop and go, obviously you're going to burn more fuel and more emissions put in the air. Is that part of the calculation as the loss, when you show the loss?
Yeah, there certainly are. I didn't include them in this slide here, but there is additional information out there about the fuel use and the amount of emissions that trucks are putting out just due to this wasted time.
Is that available?
Yes. Yeah, I'd be happy to share that with the committee.
That will be good to have. And I agree with you. Every time I travel the freeways, I see trucks off the freeway on the side or on ramp taking their time off, and very unsafe.
Yeah, in this national report that was just released, they actually surveyed the actual drivers, the users of the system themselves, not just the companies. And it specifically mentions here in California, the I-5 corridor is a huge need, because when you hit that hours of service mark and you can't go any further, you have to park. And so sometimes truckers are put in unsafe positions where they have to park in a place that maybe not be the best for themselves, but also other motorists. And so we need to take a strong look at how to expand that.
Thank you.
RJ, just one factor before we move on to Lisa. You had mentioned in another hearing or wherever we were, it might have been the freight strategy, that there was a number, 51,000 trucks idling for a year. Was that correct?
Yeah, it was the cost of congestion. It's the equivalent of taking 51,000 drivers, I believe, and just having them set idle for a full year, not making any money, not producing anything.